Buenos días. En el segundo.
Good morning. In the second day of our meeting, and today, Thursday, 23rd of September, we start with the workshops. And before starting, I would like to make two announcements. The first one is we have reached 3,000 registered members, participants. It's quite relevant. And the second one is that in spite that this Congress is fundamentally free Congress, we are asking for visum, etc. We didn't have money for the French-speaking participants to have simultaneous interpretation from Africa. They have organized by Zoom the whole system of simultaneous interpretation for them, so that right now those who require, well, I'm going to give to the organization the link so that those of you who want to connect in French can do so through this Zoom. Two people translating for you our message. But anyhow, we keep on asking for help, economic help. And without further ado, we'll start one of the star workshops in this meeting that is focused on what is the title of the natural awareness of fertility or recognition, with three exceptional people. I think we're going to have a very good time. 1 hour and 40 minutes with three people who have an enormous experience in helping the couples to understand each other, to know each other, to diagnose each other, and recognize this fertility window. I leave you now with Guadalupe Alsina from the Reconocer Association from Barcelona, Lourdes Durango, whom I have the honor to work with her in the University Clinic from Navarra in Madrid, and also with Eva Corujo, who came with her own baby to the Congress in order to be able to be with all of you. So I hope you will enjoy this.
Buenos días a
Good morning. We are going to start this workshop. This workshop will be introduced by three experts in fertility recognition that belong to the Reconocer Association. I briefly explain what the association is all about, because we belong, all of us, to that association in order to frame somehow this workshop. Reconocer Association is founded in 1990 in Barcelona, hosted by a group of professionals who felt the need of making known and spreading the teaching of natural family planning, of natural recognition of fertility. They also wanted to encourage research and also the lifestyle entailed by these natural methods. Right now, the group of active professionals is formed by physicians, nurses, gynecologists, midwives, pharmacists, and psychologists, all of them trained as experts in natural family planning. Reconocer has different delegations throughout Spain, Catalonia, in Madrid, Galicia, Castilla-La Mancha, Andalucía, Basque Country, and Valencia. And it adhered the European Study for Family Planning Education, and it's part of the board of that association. During those years, they have organized 8 international symposia, and we have participated in the organization of other scientific events, both in Spain, Europe, and America. It has several publications, and 7 of its members have published their PhDs related with this topic. Several of its members are teaching at universities in several places in Spain, the International University of Catalonia, Navarra, Sant Pau and Seu, the Catholic University of Murcia, and Francisco de Vitoria University in Madrid. And at present, we have a digital platform as well in order to teach, and we have a course to train future experts when we train many professionals from Spain and also from several countries from America. Well, once I've said that, I'm going to introduce you the speakers. The speakers who will give this deliver this workshop is Eva Corujo, who is pharmacist, trained in natural family planning since 2014-2015, and she belongs to the Association of Reconocer and Women España and is training the couples of users. She's got 7 children. Lourdes Durango is a nurse, teaches in natural recognition of Since 2000, she works in Navarra Clinic in Madrid, and she belongs to Reconocer as well. And myself, I am a nurse. I was trained as expert in natural recognition of fertility in 2000 as well. I work as a monitor and coach and expert for couples of users and future experts as well. And also human sexuality and recognition of fertility, or awareness of fertility. Good morning. First of all, we wanted to thank the organizers of this meeting for all the hours of dedication that are behind in order to bring it forward. We know this has been a hard work, and for having invited us to participate. And also those who have studied throughout the years on this topic and from whom we have learned everything that we know. And of course, we also wanted to thank our husbands, Jorge, Pablo, and Gonzalo, because Guadalupe, Eva, and myself, we have a commitment with teaching of fertility awareness that goes beyond our own personal professional dedication. Without the support of our husbands, we couldn't make this coaching for our couples with a personal dedication that this involves, and we couldn't be here either. The aim of this workshop is to explain in a simple manner what are the indicators of fertility that any woman can detect and observe in order to be able to recognize in each cycle where her fertility window is. This is the fertility window. To nature, open to nature, a river, it's always linked with there is humidity. We have to know that this fertility awareness is valid at every point in time in life, the life of a woman, both in adolescence, adult age, in stress situation when the woman has a higher level of stress than normal. Also when she's breastfeeding, we can also recognize this fertility window. When there are diseases, it's a method that is safe and can also be used when there are serious diseases where the woman shouldn't become pregnant, and also in the perimenopausal period. It's control or monitor of the health of the woman. This means that it can help us to detect different pathologies. For instance, infections, deficit of vitamins A and E, polycystic ovary. We can see an ultrasound image of a polycystic ovary, deficit in the luteal body, hypothyroidism, and endometriosis. Because with this, we will see that it is possible to distinguish the normal changes that happen in the cycle throughout life from what is not normal and can be caused by a pathology or a disease. By fertility awareness, the woman knows herself and her health. There are women that don't know this. They have been for years with some problem, and they think it's normal, and they don't go to the physician and ask. And on the other hand, there are other women who are concerned because they see changes that they don't know are normal changes or physiological changes, and to know all this is those uncertainties are then being removed. When we talk about natural methods, the first thing that comes to our mind is that we have to count days, and counting days, well, where is that fertility window? That's why we think it shouldn't be something too effective, especially when there are women who have very irregular cycles. But it's not something that is so random as counting days. It's based on physiological basis, supported by science fundamentally. Woman is fertile only a few days in the cycle, whilst the fertility of man is continuous. The physiological basis of the natural methods are given by this periodical fertility of the woman. And if nature has made the woman fertile only a few days a month, to recognize which of those days is obviously the most logic and natural way of regulating fertility. So what is the fertility window? Well, we could say these are the days in the cycle of the woman in which sexual intercourse can conclude in a pregnancy. This is this target. If we know where it is, we can decide at every point in time in life if we want to target to the target, so to speak, or not, if we have to distance a pregnancy or we decide to increase our family. Obviously, this workshop will not be enough to control it perfectly. The learning for each woman has to be followed by the follow-up of coach or an expert that is going to guide her and helping her interpret all her observations. This learning, when the goal is to get pregnant, is easier because if we are wrong in one day, we have the opportunity. There is another day to try it again. But when the goal is to make distancing of pregnancies, the learning is somewhat more complex and requires a greater training and coaching, because if we are wrong in one day, there are consequences that may derive from it. Knowing this is health. It's the adequate evolution of the mucus pattern is the sign that there are good hormonal levels and that the cervix of the uterus responds to the hormones. And if it corresponds to an increase in temperature, body temperature, the ovulation is probably taking place normally. So what we're going to see in this workshop? First of all, Guadalupe will tell us basic notions of the ovarian cycle, fertility window, how to recognize it, and what are the indicators that are going to delimit it. Then Eva will talk about the cervical secretion or the mucus pattern. And then I will come back to tell you about the baseline temperature, what are the conditions that should exist, and other indicators are the changes in the cervix and other minor indicators. And then we will see some examples of how to recognize that fertility window in more difficult situations as breastfeeding, stress, and the perimenopausal period. Well, we are going to locate the fertility window within the ovarian cycle. It's like talking about the menstrual cycle, genital cycle. We don't all use the same name. I apologize because I forget to say that Lourdes Durango has 8 children and I've got 6. We are all numerous family mothers. I only spoke about Eva's children, and we are all very proud of our children. Well, the ovarian cycle is the whole set of modifications that naturally take place in the genital female apparatus as a consequence of the hormonal changes produced by ovulation. Those changes are going to be achieved in the ovary, in the endometrium, in the cervix, and in the hypophyseal hypothalamus axis. Well, let's clarify the concepts. I understand that some of the people who are visualizing this workshop are not experts in fertility awareness, and we're going to talk also for them. This is to open a window to this knowledge as we talk about windows. When we talk about the first day of the cycle, we talk about the first day of menstruation. This seems quite obvious for many people, but when we get in touch for the first time with a user and we ask, for instance, how long does your cycle last? Normally they say how long their menstruation lasts, and when is the day it starts? They say that it starts from the first day the menstruation is finished. So this concept is very important to clarify, although it seems quite obvious. It's also important to know that normally the cycles last around 28 days. And in order to teach natural methods, we talk about a model cycle. This doesn't mean that women with cycles of 25 days are not normal. And if you have a cycle of 32 days, this is not normal either. These are normal as well. But more or less, the average is around 28 days. And it's very good for us to use this model of cycle to be able to distinguish the different phases. When we talk about ovulation, it's the release of an ovocyte from the ovary. Menstruation is the bleeding that is related with the ovulatory cycle. But nevertheless, when we talk about, menstruation, it was that, but the bleeding is a bleeding that is not related with ovulation. For many users who don't know and who have not been doing this awareness of fertility, any bleeding is menstruation. Ovarian hormones are estrogens and progesterone. There are 2. And the hypophyseal hormones that will be very important, and we will talk about them as well, are FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and the luteinizing hormone, LH. If we talk about the phases of the cycle, in the cycle of 28 days, we will see them very well. We will talk about the menstrual phase, pre-ovulatory phase, peri-ovulatory phase, and post-ovulatory phase. Well, this whole ovarian cycle is guided by a neuroendocrine system that is quite complex, and we have to understand it in order then to be able to understand the impact of these fertility indicators. This neuroendocrine system that is complex has a feedback system that is positive and negative. The stimulus starts in the regulatory center in the hypothalamus, stimulating the hypophysis, making that this secretes FSH. FSH, in turn, produces a maturation of the follicles in the ovary. This maturation of the follicles in the ovary makes that the follicle on itself starts secreting estrogens. And estrogens, we will see, they have an impact on specific fertility indicators that the woman will be able to recognize perfectly well. Once those estrogens are high, in turn, are going to cause in the hypophysis a release of another hormone that is LH. LH produces a rupture of the follicle with a consequent release of the ovocyte. And once the ovocyte has been released, what happens is that this small wound that exists there from the rupture of the ovocyte has a name that is called luteal body and starts generating progesterone, secreting progesterone that has an impact on the fertility indicators. And once the progesterone after ovulation is high, it inhibits the possibility that LH and FSH are produced again. So an ovulation, spontaneous ovulation cannot any longer occur. The luteal body is able to secrete progesterone during a maximum of 16 days. After 16 days, it will not be able to secrete progesterone. The progesterone level will decrease, and then we will have desquamation of the endometrium, and we have a new menstruation, and we start the whole cycle all over again. And this is neuroendocrine system that is complex, that happens in women in each one of the cycles. If we compare it with the neuroendocrine system of the man, that is much more linear and simple, explains that women are more complex as well. And to explain this to the couples is very important because it will help them to empathize with each other. The woman understands that the man is much more easier and that woman is much more complex when they have to live some circumstances during their lives. And we use that to the couples, although it seems a very scientific knowledge, but well explained, it's very important for the couple to understand that this is how it works. As we said, this ovarian cycle, those changes produced by the hormones are going to be correlated with different aspects. Here we can see the action of the different hypophyseal hormones. FSH, that is high in the first phase of the cycle, then it goes down. LH increases with a peak in the blood 14 days after ovulation, and it decreases. It has a correlation with what happens in the ovary, maturation of the follicle, rupture of the follicle with releasing the ovocyte, and action of the luteal body. The estrogens that are high in the first phase of the cycle, and in the second phase, we have progesterone. As to what happens at the level of the endometrium, we see the discoloration of the endometrium during menstruation, the growth of a proliferative endometrium, and then a secreting endometrium during the second phase. If we take the temperature in this woman, we will see that the first phase of that cycle, the temperature is low, and with the action of progesterone, the temperature goes up. So the fertility window will be located approximately through around those days that I'm pointing at now. This is the fertility window. It's a little bit before the ovulation and slightly later as well, a few days later as well. But fertility windows, there are many, of course. As there are windows in the world, there are many fertility windows in the woman. And there are windows that are wider, windows that are smaller, very narrow windows and very wide windows. And in reality, this is an image of what happens with the couples, because the fertility window will be different for each couple and will change as well for each couple throughout their life. What does this fertility window depend on? There is a very interesting concept that we have to explain, the combined fertility. We've said that the woman is fertile by herself only in the moment of ovulation. The male is always fertile. But why, when we talk about fertility window, do we say that a woman is fertile a few days before ovulation, if at the end there is one ovulation or two consecutive ovulations in the same hormonal framework, and the ovule has a duration of hours? So what is conditioning that the fertility window starts before? Well, let's see that there are several factors that have an influence on this fertility window. First of all, what happens with the woman? The woman is born approximately with 1 to 2 million follicles at birth throughout the reproductive life. We will have an atresia of the follicles, 500 ovulations throughout her life. And from the age of 35, her fertility will start to decline progressively, slowly. And more or less, the fertility will end when the ovarian reserve ends at around the age of 50, when menopause arises. But we know that just because we have a follicular atresia and that after 35 years fertility starts declining, it's going to be hard that a woman from the age of 40 on gets pregnant, especially if it's the first time that she is going to get pregnant. But nevertheless, in man, we've said that the hypothalamus and hypophyseal axis was much simpler, easier. The man has primordial cells that will give rise to spermatozoids that will be activated. Each testis will produce 200 million of primordial cells per day, and the fertility will start to decline after the age of 50, very slowly until the age of 70. There are famous cases of people who have generated children at an older age. I'm not going to name here some of them, but especially for those of us who are slightly old already, we know who they are. Each ejaculation, but not the whole the content of all ejaculations is the same. We will have situations in which we will see ejaculations of this type, many, many sperms with an impressive mobility. This is an enormous one, but in this one, at moments in the life of a man, is similar to this other picture with scarce sperms, tied sperms, due to the circumstances in the climatology in this situation, for instance. But it is true that they will make changes as well in this sperm.
But at the end of the day, the secret of survival for sperm is not in man, it's also in women. But what is going to allow this sperm to survive and fertilize? Well, something that Eva's going to be talking about, which is cervical secretion, that allows the sperm to survive and makes it possible to produce fertility. And this is what is going to open the fertility window. And the sperms, well, they're going to inside the uterus and the crypts, and they're going to survive for 5 or even 7 days, waiting for this ovulation to occur. But it's not only all of these things that we've pointed out that are physiological that are obviously going to have an influence on the fertility window, but this also applies to lifestyles. And we, as monitors, have a task at our consultations of promoting these healthy lifestyles, because at the end of the day, these healthy lifestyles are going to have an impact on fertility. If we are individuals that have healthy eating habits, and especially if the woman drinks water, which means that she's going to have cervical mucus that is easier to assess and it's going to be in a better condition. And if we also have a physical activity that is both members of the couple, that would be even better still. And if we smoke, this is going to have an influence on our fertility. If we've had sexually transmitted diseases, this is going to have a very significant impact on fertility. And there are some very interesting studies that relate the excess of chocolate and coffee with fertility problems, especially in men. And the ideal thing would be for us to sleep from 6 to 8 hours a day, and that we take life in a sufficiently relaxed manner, so that stress does not have the impact that it has, because it has consequences that we can see directly in the charts. Fertility is a gift that has to be, you have to take care of. You have to pamper it. And the fact that we have a healthy lifestyle improves fertility. And then there's something else that's also going to have an influence as regards becoming pregnant. And there's no icon to represent that. And that is, what kind of attitude do we have in vis-a-vis life? Because when when a couple comes along to learn about these natural systems, it doesn't help if they're anguished, if they are anxious. So we have to help them do this in a calm manner, because if there's anguish, the woman is going to not be able to do things properly, and she won't be able to recognize those fertility signs. And, well, then people also become desperate because they want to have that child, no matter what. And, well, bearing in mind that we all have lots of children here, it seems as if we don't empathize with these couples, but we do empathize because we know how tough this is for all of them. But our mission is also to allow them to do this very peacefully, obviously leaving a door open to hope with all the contributions that we make to improve their health, but also by making them accept what reality is all about and also the constraints imposed by life. And that's all from me. I'm going to give the floor now to my colleague, to Eva.
Bueno, a mí me ha tocado la parte no sé, ¿se oye?
Can you hear me? I'm supposed to talk about cervical secretion, and which is, well, the big unknown issue for many women. That is, all women in a fertile age have cervical secretion, but most of them, well, ourselves, when we started to learn to become aware of our fertility, I didn't have a clue. And each one of you has a different answer, I suppose, but this is the big unknown component, and sometimes it's the key to fertility, as has been explained by my colleagues. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to try to explain to you in a straightforward manner what this actually means. And, well, to kick off, where does this cervical secretion come from? And this is a very important thing, because all of us women, when we start with these courses, I always ask them, have you ever seen any kind of flow, anything that comes out? And all of them say yes. But, well, they don't know how to give it a name, and they don't know how to describe it. But it's important to know where this comes from, where the secretion comes from. And it comes from the neck of the uterus. I'm not sure if you can see it. Anyway, it comes from this area here, which is a narrow section of the uterus. It's not the lowest section. And if you take a look at this blowed-up picture, well, this is a drawing, but in any case, it shows the crypts, the cervical crypts, where we're going to have all of the secretion. So it's an organ that measures something like 3 centimeters. It's very small, but at the same time, it's one of the key elements. But just imagine this 3D. And here we have a picture, but you have to imagine it as if it were a cylinder. And it is surrounded by glandular epithelium, which is what we can find there, are cells that are constantly producing cervical secretion. And this is a very important thing, because it seems that cervical secretion only happens sometimes. No, but there's always some kind of cervical secretion underway. And there's 95% of the secreting cells. So it's a secreting organ that is permanently in operation. And there's 5% of the ciliary cells that what they're going to do is move those flows or these secretions that emerge. Professor Otherblad said what you can see here. He was a scientist that dedicated his entire life, well, perhaps it wasn't his entire life, but quite a few years, to investigating what this neck was like, what this cervix was like, and the different kinds of cervical secretions, what role they play, and how important these secretions are for fertility, for the fertility in a couple. And here's that the cervix is as complex as the human eye. And he also told us that it's something really complex, but at the same time, any woman is capable of learning to recognize these secretions in her body. And as Wada said, we have a brain stimulation, and we have the hormones, and here we have another picture, so that you can understand this stimulation of the uterus neck throughout the cycle. The brain is always in control. And this is what I always say when a session starts, which is the most important organ of the reproductive system. It's the brain, because that's where these hormonal signals are sent from. And this stimulates the ovaries, and this produces estrogen and progesterone. And what are they going to do? They're going to act directly on the uterus at 2 levels. on the body of the uterus, in other words, the sac, this where the endometrium is and the walls are, and on the neck. So here, this is going to be one of the key elements, because all of the secretions that a woman sees throughout the cycle, all of them have a hormonal correlation with what's going on. And we don't produce secretions just like that. Everything makes sense. And this is where when it becomes wonderful, because we learn to know ourselves, which is possible by observing these secretions that come from this channel, from the cervical channel. And we are capable of knowing when, in what stage of the cycle we are by observing. And I tell users many times, look, I'll explain what the hormones are all about, but in any case, you don't need to know what kind of hormones we have. You don't have to think, how many estrogens do I have, or how much progesterone do I have? No, it's just with that observation that by registering the situation, we are going to be able to do that. Because all that secretion that comes from this cervical channel, well, it is communicates with the large sac of the uterus and down with the vagina, and it falls thanks to its own weight. So this is what we have in terms of hormonal regulation. So as my colleague said before, with ovarian hormones, well, this is the estrogen curve, okay, this green line, this peak. And estrogens, let's say that we could say that they are the hormone of the fertile window, and progesterone, which is the hormone of the second stage of the cycle, is what is going to close the fertility window in such a manner that this image, I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, well, it's very visual, and these are different flows that are going to be produced. So when you have lots of estrogens inside the body, which at the same time, well, this is because there's a development of these follicles in the ovaries. In other words, the body's getting ready to ovulate, and that is going to have a direct influence on secretion that is going to change, and it's going to become much more fluid and much more elastic and transparent. And these are the changes that I will try to explain to you later on. And once progesterone goes up, because the woman has ovulated, because progesterone only increases when the woman has ovulated, and what it's going to do is thicken the cervical secretion. So we always have cervical secretion, but what happens is that sometimes it's a secretion that is much more liquid and with characteristics that are easy to see, because it falls, it's abundant, and sometimes we might not see anything, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It means that it's there inside the neck of the uterus, because it's a secretion that is very thick and that is clogging the neck up. Well, this picture, this gentleman, is Professor Otherblad, who studied or who discovered all of these things over the years, the different kinds of cervical secretion, and how they crystallize, because cervical secretions, when they dry very quickly. They crystallize very quickly, and depending on their composition, if there's more or less water, depending on hormonal stimulation, crystallization also changes. I'm not going to dwell on this, but anyway, just so that you know that this is something that has been studied scientifically, and it's not an improvisation or anything like that. So there's a very big scientist behind this. Cervical secretion. Well, these are the different types of cervical secretion that were discovered thanks to Professor Otherblad. They have different functions, so not all these secretions, because there are different kinds of secretions, but not all of them do the same thing. And this is a very important thing, because what we find is that sometimes secretion has a protective function. So in other words, a secretion that is very thick and which blinds the neck, because there's infertility, it closes the door. And I like to refer to this neck as if it were the door, the exit or the entrance door for a baby or for menstruation, but it's also an entrance door. It could give rise to infections, of course, but now that we're talking about fertility, let's just think that it's the entrance door for the sperm. And many times these sperms are going to find a neck that is closed. So this secretion, what it's doing is just clogging the system up. It's not working, and it's a protective function. And when we are inside the fertility window, secretions change, and their functions change too, in such a manner that at many points in time, these secretions are going to perform a selection function. They're going to act like a natural filter through which only those sperms that are okay are going to go through. And, well, everything is very well thought and we have been made very well, but cervical secretion has the function of selecting the sperm that is okay. And those that don't move properly or have malformations, they don't go through. They just stay there. Transport. This is a very important item because my colleague said this before, because cervical secretion is as if it were a motorway where sperms have to drive down. And then, well, fertile cervical secretion is the best thing for sperm because we're talking about the smallest cell of the human body, and it's always accompanied by liquid. When it comes out of the man, it's accompanied by semen, and well, there's prostatic liquid and seminal liquid. But when it reaches the body of the woman, if it comes across a fertile secretion, well, it's going to be able to swim or cross through the door. And then we have the sperm capacitation, we call it, and this is something that only takes place in the fertile secretion of women, and that's a very important thing, because we have the expert here, who's Lourdes, but when sperms come out of the body of the man, they are apparently okay, they're mature, but they need to go through that last stage that only takes place in the fertile secretion of the woman. Okay, well, let's look into the interesting part of the whole business. This is all well and good, I know, and fertility and the fertile window, but let's say that the key element, and this is what we work on, and that what we have to do is teach people how to recognize these secretions. And it's true that we've all heard people talk about cervical secretion or mucus, which is what it's also called, but from there to learning what your cervical secretions mean, there's a big step. And this is the major challenge that we have posed to our users, our female and male users, because it's funny, because when men come along to the sessions, in fact, we encourage them. And many of them come along and say, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here, Eva, because you're talking about mucus and secretions all day long, and I'm surplus to requirements. And I said, no, because you wouldn't be nothing without those secretions. So fertility always involves two. And it's very good for them to learn that they're not going to see the secretions. Well, I had a couple, and he thought that what he had to do, that he had to keep an eye on her secretions and giving them names, and the poor guy was very upset. But anyway, men also need to know what's going on, because the pregnancy probabilities, this concerns too. It's always concerns too, not only her. But what is important is, well, you have to bear in mind that any woman can do this. I mean, you don't need to have any specific studies or training. You don't need to be a healthcare professional. And in fact, the learning of cervical secretion is also done by illiterate women in many cases, and where this is taught. Any woman is capable of learning because, well, the only thing they have to do is interpret whatever they see and what they feel. Okay, and off you go. Once you've got that. Right, first, and well, these are the conditions to observe. You have to follow this on a daily basis, and every day is different, and each day has to be interpreted. This might sound like nonsense, but we want to go quicker than the cycles, or we're waiting for things to happen that perhaps will not happen. And no, this is all about following this on a daily basis. Just one odd day doesn't say anything. And I'm saying this because when we are dealing with so many couples, you know that WhatsApp is permanently in action. And I receive messages saying, if I've seen this kind of mucus, what does that mean? I don't know, is my answer. You have to see the context, the before and the after. And just an odd day doesn't say anything. So we need to have a daily register. This is a very important thing. So it's a commitment for this woman when she starts to learn. And, well, she needs to know that if she doesn't observe this every single day, what she's doing doesn't make any sense because we are missing the rest of the cycle. And what I feel throughout the cycle, and that is going to allow us to determine, or that's going to allow the woman to recognize what her patterns are like and see how her evolutions are, because hormones change. And estrogens go up little by little, and this can be seen in the uterine neck, and they can see this in the secretions and in the woman's own feelings. So this is a very important thing. And sometimes, well, users come along when we look at the charts and you say, well, this is impossible. Well, they say to you, this is impossible, but you either have all the data or it's impossible to interpret a chart. And one of the important things is that if you've never done this before, I would like to encourage you to do so because it's great. When they see this cycle in the chart, they think that it's unbelievable. And they said, well, how come nobody told me about this before? So you can see how things change, and they never noticed that before. So two things are observed. Firstly, secretion, which is what we see, and, well, what you feel then. Your sensations. Secretion is something you can see. It's something very easy because, well, it can be pretty objective. And as a matter of fact, most women want to see what's going on at all times. And they say they want to see this because it makes them feel very safe. Whatever you see helps you a lot. But let's say that the key issue here is feeling on having sensations. And this is the most difficult part because we've never been taught that. I always tell them that we have one more sense, which is this feeling that all women have. But as we've never stopped to look at what this is all about, we found that it was pretty difficult because then, well, it's somewhat instinctive. So what we can see, therefore, and generally speaking, what we can see is what you see when you go to the bathroom or whatever. And you can see that flow comes out. And this is something that we can see because, well, most times we can see this in the toilet paper. When you wipe yourself, you can see that. So you can see that what we do is we look at the toilet paper and, well, it's true that on your underwear, well, you know that something's happened there because a woman goes to the toilet and they say, I've seen something on my underwear. So there's something there, we don't know what because we cannot interpret it. Well, because the secretion dries up very quickly, and then, well, you cannot really give it any characteristics. We know that something has happened there that has to be taken into account, but let's say that what we really have to interpret is what remains on the toilet paper. It says, well, if white toilet paper, well, the standard toilet paper, because you know that colored paper sometimes can interfere with that observation of secretion. And what is very important is never do any internal investigations. Don't put your fingers inside. Why? Because if you do that, what are you going to come across? It's the vagina. The vagina is mucosa that is already lubricated, that always has something, and that could be very confusing. I always tell them if there's a secretion that comes out because of its own weight, because of the effect of gravity, you don't have to do anything. And things that we see, well, this is a picture of was one of the users. She's provided us with this picture. She had it pretty liquid, and it's very visual, isn't it? I always tell women, well, you could look at as many pictures as you want, but the important thing is, one, to learn to recognize herself. And sometimes you expect to see secretions you've seen in a picture, but they never happen. And this, well, you can interpret whatever you see. How can you do that? Well, by giving it a name. They are thicker and stickier discharges, and we have to give them a name, and we need to know things about consistency, color. They are translucid, yellow, whitish, elastic. Well, these are some of the names that we use, and these are mainly the names that are given to the kinds of cervical secretion. So one eventually learns to give names and to understand all of these secretions. And then as far as what we feel is concerned, and this is what I said before, this is the part that we usually find much more difficult, because feeling or our sensations are something very subjective. So what do you feel? I don't know. And this is something that is very subjective, and what I say to them is that this subjectivity makes us feel lost, and we feel that we cannot. Well, what I always tell them is that one has to find in oneself objectivity. So one learns how to detect her feelings and knows that if what they're feeling, if it draws her attention or if it's the usual thing. I'm not sure if I'm explaining things clearly enough now. But anyway, these sensations are learned by a woman herself and not by speaking to her friend. What do you feel? No. And in fact, the charts, we never share the charts. And when we do this group or individual teaching, I always tell them, look, the interpretation of the charts has to be done individually, because if not, we'd go mad. Because this is a very personal thing. One has to learn. And, well, the feeling, well, to feel something, we don't need our eyes. We just have to perceive something. I don't know if you knew this, but there are blind women who draw charts that are absolutely unbelievable. Why? Because the fact of seeing that becomes an obstacle because we are too keen on seeing means that we lose that sensation. They don't have their eyesight, so they have much more developed feelings. And this is impressive. Why? Because we feel 24 hours a day. We feel during our daily activities and when we go to and fro. We don't need to see to feel. And where do we feel? We feel here, in this area here. And this is in this part of the vulva. And this is the cervix is what produces all of those secretions. And the secretions are going to fall down the vagina. And where does she feel them? In the vulva. And this is something that is asked many times. And, well, people say it's very hot, or I'm sweating, or I do lots of sport. Well, one thing is sweating that comes from the thighs, and another thing is what you feel in the vulva, which shows all of these changes in the cervical secretions that are happening during the cycle. And we always feel. Well, what do we feel? Sometimes nothing. What does that mean? It means that nothing is happening. I don't know how to explain this. So nighttime comes along, and, well, throughout the day we observe and we feel, and then at the end of the day, at night, that's when we have to think, what happened today? And there are times we don't feel anything. It's like being in the desert. I have some pictures here so that you can understand what I'm actually referring to. And this is something that one learns, and you can give it your own definition. Sometimes it's humid or damp. Something's going on. Sometimes it's wetter, and something's coming out, and I feel very wet. And other times it's more lubricated. In other words, you feel a flow that is producing lots of slipping around. And these feelings don't really need you to see anything. Nothing happens if you don't see, because many times, well, people say, I felt, I don't know how, but I didn't see anything, and it makes them feel very uncomfortable. That's okay. I said, don't worry. So this is throughout the day. This is an important thing from the moment we get up until we go to bed at night. Why? Well, because this is what it's like, because secretions fall by the effect of gravity. So during the day, our normal activity, whilst we are in the vertical position, that's when we can perceive things that come out. Or when you go to the bathroom, for instance, and you can register this at night too. Well, it's not at night, but it's rather when you are going to lie down until you get up the following morning. It doesn't always have to be the same time of the day. It's just when you're going to lie down, when you stop perceiving and seeing. And we also talk about the most fertile characteristics, because we can see several things or feel several things during the day. What we always bear in mind is what, the fertile characteristics. And these are the two issues, the two questions that a woman has to ask herself, that has a register. And this is a chart that uses the Billings method, but it could be any other method too. And to take note of what is it you've felt today, what mucus you've seen today. So these are the two questions that one has to ask oneself without thinking about hormones, in such a manner that this is how we can interpret these fertility and infertility patterns that one has, and with oneself, without comparing yourself to others. And very quickly, in a very simple manner, I'm going to review what would be a cycle so that you can visualize this, so you can have a clearer picture. Well, the first stage is not the menstruation. Well, the uterus is open, the neck is open, and all the contents of the metrium go down. So what a woman feels as if she were wet by the menstruation. So when you move on to the menstrual stage, normally, and these are just general issues, I'm talking about a standard cycle, what a woman finds is that she has more dryness. So nothing is happening because, well, she hasn't given enough time for the body to produce estrogens. So therefore, the neck of the uterus is, there's a mucus there, there's a plug. But it's plugging up the area, so that means that there's going to be dryness and the woman won't really see very much happening. But when you move on to a fertile window, there's estrogen activity and there's ovarian activity, and the uterus neck is modified. And then a time comes, which is also called the point of change, when the woman starts to feel things little by little, because, estrogens come out little by little. And this is not from 0 to 100 all of a sudden. It's little by little. The woman gradually perceives throughout her fertile window, as estrogen goes up, she feels or sees that there are more sensations. There's a slight dampness, and she becomes more wet or more lubricated. Anyway, there's an evolution in this pattern, and this is telling her that there's a possible fertility. And this is a very important thing, because from the very first moment when the woman perceives a possible fertility based on her patterns, that means that that couple needs to know that as from that first day, there could be a possibility of becoming pregnant because of what we said before, because the neck starts to open up and sperm cells can go through and they can stay inside. And this is these sperm cells can stay there for several days inside the neck, because there's a fertile secretion that is taking care of those sperm cells. In the chart, you have a peak day, and you can see that it's a little triangle, and this is the last day of with the biggest sensation of fertility. So let's say that this would be the last day of maximum fertility, and we always count this as 1, 2, 3. You have to leave some margin to close the fertile window, okay?
The whole post-ovulation phase, once the progesterone starts increasing enough amounts, the cervix, the progesterone is closing the uterus, apart from increasing the temperature, as Lourdes will explain now. It closes the uterus neck or cervix. It's quite logical, this protecting function, because if there is fertilization at the moment, the implantation is 1 week later, more or less. Embryo has to be guided, has to be protected, and the cervix is closed so that there are no infections entering. And this is in the phase of more dryness, when the woman doesn't feel too much or nothing. The cervix is closed. And it's important to look at this image. I show it so that we can visualize that not all cycles are the same. This was a standard cycle, very general explanations, but then we can see different cycles, shorter cycles. The first one, the typical normal cycle with all its phases, menstruation, an infertility period that varies, length in the fertile phase that can vary, and the post-ovulatory phase as well. If we look at this, that may happen. Well, very often women come, I got pregnant during menstruation. Yes, I believe it. It's not because we are ovulating at the same time that we are bleeding, but the fertile window is ahead of time. So what we see is that as soon as menstruation stops, the woman has feelings and secretions, and there can be a pregnancy. This is important because when a new cycle starts, we have to forget about the previous ones. The variability of cycles is very wide and more throughout life. We will see more specific situations during breastfeeding and during stress situations and premenopause. There are situations in the life of a woman that makes that the cycles, we are not perfect machines, and they may change very much. And at the same time, we have a cycle maybe, and we say, oh, how long it takes to come to this fertile window. And at the end, we have shorter or longer cycles, bearing in mind that the length of the cycle depends on the pre-ovulatory phase, all that hormonal development that Guada has explained before. The hypothalamus-hypophysis axis, the brain is very important there. Once we ovulate in this triangle that you can see here, that's the moment of ovulation. Once we ovulate, the second phase of the cycle is maintained constant always, between 11 and 16 days. What varies is the part before. In normal cycle, between 25 and 35 days. In shorter cycles, less than 25 days. Longer cycles, more than 35. And very often, it's quite key to learn to recognize oneself, those fertile or infertile patterns, because very often it seems, or in the lower image, it seems that its fertile window is going to start, but it never ends in ovulation. This is possible to see or interpret it in charts. Here we have the representation of the brown area is infertile, and the white are interrupting. This can vary very much. It depends on the cycle. But sometimes it seems that the thing starts, they start be changing, but we see it goes back again. And what we teach throughout learning is that the woman has to learn how to recognize the peak day, the probable day of the ovulation, the last day of feeling of slipperiness, the last day the woman perceives after a period of evolution of her fertile window, she perceives a maximum feeling with or without a discharge, and then a sudden change. And this is due, we go back to hormones again. I'd like to talk about hormones because we understand many things in that way. When the estrogens go up, those small dots, blue squares, what this tells us is that at the end, so that you can see that this chart is a hormonal reflection of what is happening. It's like a mirror, so that you understand me better. When the estrogens go up, we start having a lot of change. The uterus cervix is being activated. There are changes in the cervical secretions. And as soon as progesterone goes up in the second phase of the cycle, what we then find in the chart is that the woman has been able to indicate what is the peak day. We are able to recognize perfectly well throughout the cycle what is happening with that very simple observation. And in order to comment something else, we always said that we have to take into account there are things that can change the cervical secretions. Age, the drugs, medications that could alter those secretion patterns, hormonal alterations, pathologies of the uterus cervix. Just to comment the issue of age briefly, for instance, the hormonal and contraceptives with age, what they do, this is the cervix. The red dots are representing the infertile days. There is an aging of the cervix under normal conditions. Well, as we have wrinkles and gray hair, well, the uterus or the cervix is also getting older. We realize because we don't see so much secretion. And nevertheless, a woman that is very young, 17 years, in the peak day, this is at the maximum. And the uterus is fantastic secretions throughout life. Our fertile life, this is going down. And sometimes there can be problems in the cervix, but these are pathologies. This requires a specialist, an expert. But in the charts, we can see, as I have been showing, fantastic cycles and everything very beautiful. Very often in the chart of a woman, what we can see is that there is something that doesn't fit, really. There is a mucus pattern that is insufficient. There are things that are striking, altered phases in the cycle. Then we start the phase of having to go to a specialist, revising the hormones, blood tests, etc. The polycystic ovary, for instance, and problems in the thyroid gland. There are many problems that can have an influence there. But what I mean is that at the end, the chart is the reflection of health. And I think Lourdes said that at the beginning as well. The important thing is, apart from recognizing that fertile window, that is key for the family natural family planning, well, it's also a reflection of health. And now I give the floor to Lourdes. After all this explanation, fantastic explanation that Eva has made, we will go over to another indicator that is also very important. I'd like to say that it is important because it's very objective. Cervical secretion is fundamental to detect fertility, but there is a lot of subjective issues and this learning as well. At the beginning of the woman, it can be hard for her to differentiate the different types of secretion. In the case of temperature, this is something that is very objective. The thermometer says a figure, and this is what you write down in your chart. It's going to do the same. Well, we are going to use gallium thermometers or digital ones, as long as they meet a series of conditions that are very important. What are the physiological bases that give a meaning to this temperature system. On the one side, the progesterone that has been already mentioned, a hormone segregated after ovulation that has an effect in the heat regulating center, making the temperature rise. Just 1 or 2 tenths, sometimes more, but sometimes just a very, very small variation. That's the importance of making a good temperature taking under giving conditions. The temperatures in the pre-ovulatory phases are low, and the temperatures in the post-ovulatory phase are higher. We know thus that the ovulation has taken place when the temperature goes up. Well, it is well recognized that the existence of a biphasic pattern with the first phase that is low temperature and higher with the second phase is like an indicator of ovulation. And the temperature gets up and is maintained elevated. People who think that then it falls again, no. It's the temperature is increased and then there is a plateau, more or less stable. But the temperatures are maintained high, and when the temperature goes down, we know that we are going to have the menstruation. We may find another type of chart in which the plateau doesn't seem so stable. It has some ups and downs. But nevertheless, it's maintained higher above the line that separates the high temperatures from the low ones. So although there are ups and downs, we know it's still in the higher end. But we can also find pathological charts, as this one, for instance, because it's important the amount of days that the temperature is maintained at high level. When this amount of days that Guadalupe mentioned, this survival of the luteal body segregating progesterone has to be between 10 and 16 days. If this length of second phase is shorter, we will find a problem that is called insufficiency of the luteal body. This is a problem that can cause an underfertility. The luteal body has to maintain the levels of progesterone during the 3 first months of the pregnancy until the placenta is mature and takes in charge this hormonal secretion. If in a normal cycle it's not able to maintain a minimum of days, well, it's going to be very difficult for it to maintain for 3 months. It's a problem that has to be solved. And what are those conditions of the temperature taking? On the one side, the temperature has to be taken in under baseline conditions. What is that situation? Well, in the morning before getting up, that's when we have spent resting a longer time. It's important to have, or after absolute rest for 2 hours. From 6 to 8 in the morning, for instance, don't get up from the bed. Don't go to the bathroom. We can be awake and in bed, but not go out from bed. For that is very important as well to have the collaboration of the husband, because especially when there are small children, sometimes we have to get up throughout the night. I'm telling them, well, you can share the 2 last hours. It's for the mother to be resting. Those 2 hours, she shouldn't move, and if the child gets up, well, the father has to go and take care of it. It's important. Every day at the same hour, also on weekend, this can make them be stressed. Also on the weekend, I have to wake up at the same hour. Well, you don't have to get up. You have your alarm, you take the temperature, you can keep on sleeping, especially at the beginning. It's important because first for you to take this habit, because this is a habit that, like brushing your teeth, you get used to it, and you know after 21 days after doing this one thing every day the same, you have the habit, and see if the temperature is normal or not. And then with time, it will not be necessary to take your temperature every day. Once the temperature is high and you have met the rules that ovulation has taken place, well, it will be not necessary. We can stop taking the temperature. This should not be something that makes you be stressed. And it has to be center temperature. We can't take it in the axilla because this is what we're used to. It has to be in contact with the mucosa. It can be under the tongue or vaginal or rectal. In principle, any of the 3 paths is valid. It's true that the most stable one is vaginal or rectal, but if we change, if there is a pathology, we change the path. But the most frequent one is under your tongue. And it's important because when we take the temperature under the tongue, as soon as it has to be in contact with the mucosa 5 minutes. If it's with the vagina or the rectum, with 3 minutes is enough. And we can think Well, the digital thermometer is showing much sooner than 5 minutes. But then you have to wait for the 5 minutes. You turn it off. And then after 5 minutes you turn it on. But so it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be in contact with the mucosa to be hot, warm, or hot in the thermometer. It's important to obtain the stability of the temperature. And also in the chart we can indicate any change in your routine that may affect the temperature. Insufficient rest. When women are breastfeeding, this with cycles, they can make them stress. Well, I have to get up many times at night. Doesn't happen. Nothing happens. That's your routine. Your routine is to getting up on the night. Your baseline temperature will agree with that routine, but the odd temperature will be found that night you are sleeping the whole night. As we can see that day after day, chart after chart, the things that change in the routine are those that have to be written down. Or if you have had a very big dinner, for instance, or if you have been drinking some alcohol, changes in your schedule, travels, some stress that may affect you. And obviously, if you have some disease, especially infectious diseases that make the temperature rise, it's convenient to write it down in your chart to know how to interpret this later. I always say that they have to write it down in the same day, because 1 month later they come with a chart and we see a peak in increase and what did you do that day? Well, I don't know. I don't remember. You have to write it down the day. You have a strange temperature. What happened that day that made me have this change in my temperature? As simple as that. Another indicator that we will see as well are the changes in the cervix. We've said that before it's not necessary to see the cervical secretion to introduce your fingers in the vagina, but there are situations in which this can help us. This is an indicator that is the symptothermal indicator, third indicator that is supporting to support the others. It's not indispensable. Don't get stressed to do cervical self-palpation, but there are situations where it can help us when the cycles have not been established as during breastfeeding or premenopause, where this indicator can give us some clues about where we are in the cycle. Those cervical changes, in order to be able to know them, we have to make a cervical palpation, introduce the fingers in the vagina. It's important to know the difference of the necks that we may find, especially due to if we have given birth before or not. The neck that is here to the right, the cervix, is a woman who has never had a child. The cervical region is intact, but once she has had a delivery in a vaginal delivery, if it's through cesarean, the cervix doesn't modify, but it becomes a bilabial one when there has been a normal delivery. So it's important because once the baby passed through, one of the indicators we will see the opening changes a little bit, and it's different than what it was before. What is the methodology? How are we going to learn that? It's important to know that the woman can learn to do it. It's an important thing that we repeat very often. Everything that we explain is something that can be learned. You just have to practice. You just have to try it, and day after day, and see the changes. When do we do the self-palpation? Normally at night, after finishing menstruation. In menstruation, the cervix is open. Once the menstruation is over, with hygiene, washing your hand with clean nails and short, any friction with the cervix can produce a slight erosion that can produce some bleeding. So we have to take care about that as well. And how? It can be standing up with a foot on a chair, or squatting, or sitting in the toilet or the WC. You sit down, you sit there, and you open the vagina. And there are women who never see mucus. There are different situations. They are older, or maybe it can help. Let's see if pressing the cervix, I can see something. It's not what is normally done. This is nothing that maybe it could help in some occasions. And what are the changes? What are the parameters that we will be able to detect with this palpation? On the one side, the opening. We can see the cervix is open when the woman is the fertility range. It's open because it's filled with mucus. Mucus that the cervix is a virtual cavity. The walls are stick adhering to each other unless they contain something. It's open when we are in the fertility window, and when we are in the infertility window is hard. Another thing is the consistency. It can be soft like the lip when the woman is fertile, or hard as the tip of the nose when the woman is infertile. The height, when the ovulation is near the cervix is higher up. It's more difficult to access it. When it's infertile, the cervix is closer to the vulva, more easy to access. And then the slope, the inclination, there is no picture. I do it with my hands. Imagine this is the vagina, and this is the cervix. And the cervix is the tip of my fingers. When she's fertile, it's inclinated, and when infertile, when it's fertile, it's straight up. To favor this contact, the spermatic access in the first minutes and hours to allow this access. The vaginal pH will kill the sperm, so it's very important. It favors the rapid mechanic access for the sperms to be able to reach the place where they can survive. And here we can see an example of how we could write down this in the chart. We do the cervix self-palpation. We can see that those changes take place like everything, like the hormones. Well, we have the changes produced by the increase of estrogens. The increase of estrogens is stepwise, and the changes in the cervix are also stepwise. Before ovulation, they change little by little from being more tilted to be straighter. It's more open, and once the ovulation takes place, those changes are more sudden. And then bear in mind as well that there are a series of factors apart from the hormones that can also have an influence on the changes, so that the cervix is suffering the changes. To wash with hot water, this softens the cervix, and the prostaglandins present in the seminal fluid also soften it. The recommendation is do that before a shower and 24 hours after a sexual intercourse, because the seminal fluid is away, and we can value if the cervix is hard, soft, or due to estrogens or prostaglandins. And now we can see very rapidly other indicators that we call minor indicators. Cervical mucus, the temperature are considered major indicators because they happen in all cycles, and this happens to all women. Then there are other minor indicators, not necessarily happen in all cycles, not necessarily in all women can detect them. And those who detect it, well, the diagnosis can be positive or not, but they can guide us. There are women who can feel it with a great intensity. What are those minor indicators? Headache sometimes is linked with this cycle. Abdominal distension or intermenstrual pain. When I'm ovulating, I do feel something, like something that sticks. Or acne, for instance. It's very typical when you are going to have your menstruation. Or sensitivity, tenderness in the breasts. Many women detect after the ovulation more swollen and tender breasts, and they can write it down in the chart as well. Changes in the libido as well. It is true that the body, the nature is very wise, and it prepares you more to that sexual intercourse in those days when you are fertile. Those changes can also be seen, or in the mood that can also be affected by the cycle. We could also include, and we leave it open to research, the hormonal changes that can be detected on the market. There are different companies that if you have urine sticks, you can see the levels of the pH or progesterone or estrogens that then may help us as well. This sort of determinations are not indispensable, but it is true that in some cases, more complicated cases, complicated charts or personal situations where the cycles are more irregular or different situations, they may help us to guide us somewhat more and be used as a support for the other indicators that are written down in the chart. Thank you.
Bueno,
Well, we go on with talking about the fertility window. Let's see that women throughout our lives, we are in a wheel, so to speak, that is the ovulatory cycle, in a sort of wheel. At the beginning of puberty and menarche, we will see that those cycles will be irregular. We can have amenorrhea situations, and this will happen again when fertility is reducing or going down. In the meantime, the woman will have ovulatory cycles that are conditioned by the different circumstances or different diseases. We are going to have a central stage in our life where the normal thing would be that the ovulatory cycles follow each other. Until now, everything that we have said today corresponded to normal situations. We will see the mucus pattern, we see the temperature rise. And when we talk about normal physiological situations, to look at all the indicators is much easier. But it is true that there are special conditions that make more difficult and that produce lack of security to all these couples that are starting to know the recognition of the awareness of fertility. At the beginning, the first years, we will not stop at that, but as the girl is becoming more mature, those cycles, the logical thing is that they will be stabilized. There is a situation that many women will live throughout their life, that is the postpartum or breastfeeding condition. I'm going to focus on breastfeeding. Tomorrow, Isabel Valdez will talk about these situations, special situations as well. During breastfeeding or lactation, I will explain what the physiological bases are, what happens when a woman is breastfeeding, so that we can understand what happens with the fertility window when a baby is sucking, and this is effective. What happens at the same time is that stimulus is sending a signal to the hypophysis, to the brain, so that it produces a hormone that is prolactin. Prolactin is rising during lactation whilst the child is being breastfed. It is responsible to maintain the milk production. Whilst prolactin is high, what it does is that it inhibits the production of other hypophyseal hormones, LH and FSH. So if there is no LH and no FSH, there is no ovulation. Where there is no ovulation, there is an amenorrhea. And this is what is used as a basis. This is not always going to happen. We will see how this lactation is. But this amenorrhea was used as a basis to define what was going to be the MELA method, the amenorrhea method during maternal lactation. This method was defined in the consensus of Bellagio in Italy in 1988. Several experts gathered from the whole world in biomedical research, social sciences and political sciences, family planning and clinical practices, and medical education, health of the women and communications. And they did propose, after having observed and having reached the conclusion that this situation of amenorrhea can be used as a method to distance the pregnancies. They used 13 studies carried out in 8 countries, and they reached the next consensus. After the delivery, a woman is protected at least of 98% against pregnancy during 6 months. Whilst this breastfeeding is exclusive, she will have amenorrhea, but as a condition, she has to be exclusively giving breastfeeding. Protection against pregnancy, this is a word that we don't use. It's not our own word. I'm defining what they used in this Bellagio consensus. So the algorithm is easy. Maternal lactation has to be exclusive. We're asking questions. Has the menstruation come back? Then we will clarify what we consider menstruation after the birth, the delivery. If it didn't come back, we go to the next step. What the consensus recommends is to use a contraceptive method and keep on breastfeeding the child. If the menstruation hasn't come back, do you give supplements to your child, or there is a lot of time between every meal? If the response is yes, the same conclusion that we reached before. If it's no, we keep on asking. Is your baby older than 6 months? If the answer is yes, then we go back to the column to the right, and if the response is no, we keep on asking. No, we reach a conclusion that she doesn't need any contraceptive method, and that the protection against the pregnancy is more than 98%. It's interesting what is interesting in this method is that it so opened the door for the lactation situation. The lactation situation is a situation that produces uncertainty because the woman normally needs to be located in her cycle, and the menstruation is a data that gives us some safety and security. As the menstruation is not there, she feels insecure. If we do explain adequately those physiological bases, and if we make a registry that really those conditions are being met, well, we are giving her a very peaceful situation in that moment in her life. We are going to clarify all these conditions of the MELA method. The first one is menstruation. What do we understand by that? All these bleedings that take place before the day 56, that the child is 56 days after birth, are not considered bleedings related with ovulation, but these are postpartum bleedings. We are not going to take them into account. A bleeding before 56 days of the child doesn't rule out the use of MELA. But then Bellagio, they defined what was the menstruation.
And Miriam Lavok, was an expert in this issue, and she defined what they considered to be menstruation, because it's true that this has to be explained very clearly to a woman so that she's aware of this issue, which is an important thing. 2 consecutive days of vaginal bleeding is to rule out the use of MELA. 2 consecutive days of spotting, 1 of bleeding, or 3 consecutive days of spotting. This has to be explained perfectly well in the register, because it's more difficult for her not to notice bleeding, but sometimes she doesn't consider spotting to be important. And it's this secretion that is either brown or pink, but if it happens for 3 consecutive days, we know that that can have an impact, and it could be the warning sign that there is going to be an ovulation. So they have to have a register, and they must make sure that this has not happened. But when we spoke about breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, we have to define what this means. Because an exclusive maternal breastfeeding, or nearly exclusive, or very high, well, this is going to have an impact on fertility. And what do I mean to say? Well, it means that a baby that practically only receives the mother's milk, or takes some kind of supplement like vitamins or a little bit of water, or they could take supplements, well, because if they're given the bottle, it has to be less than 10% of what they take throughout the day. And this is a very important thing, because if we're talking about a baby that takes several supplements a day, or that there are some takes when he doesn't do that, and just takes the bottle, or we're not talking about breastfeeding that has an impact on fertility. And this is one of the conditions that has to be reviewed. Dr. Roche also added a number of conditioning factors during the first 3 months of life of the baby. And he said that if this baby is breastfed for about 100 minutes a day up to 3 months of age, and doesn't stop for more than 6 hours in between. Of course, breastfeeding is exclusive, and we are in amenorrhea. We're talking about infertility of 100%, so that woman is not going to ovulate. So what we try to do, what we monitors try to do, that are providing advisory services during this period, is we want these maternal breastfeeding to meet these conditions. Because what we have to see is that using MENA poses lots of advantages. And the Lazio consensus, well, they did say that not many hours should go by between each feeding. But, well, the experience of us people that are dedicated on fertility awareness during the breastfeeding period recommend that for these 6 months that they not separate these feedings by more than 6 hours. And there's a French group called Claire that there be at least a minimum of 6 times a day. So in the first months, it has to be exclusively breastfeeding. It has to be about 100 minutes a day, and there cannot be intervals of more than 6 hours. And the woman has to have amenorrhea, and the baby has to be breastfed for 100 minutes or less. Well, sometimes they're very quick and they're not going to reach 100 minutes, but it is easier to maintain these 6-hour intervals. Perhaps you have to wake up the child so that you can maintain those intervals, and that is feed the child 6 times a day. And then, well, 6 months. Well, this is perhaps something that hasn't been studied that much. Why? Well, because in most countries, what we do as from 6 months is use supplementary food. And if you don't do that, and if breastfeeding it's only breastfeeding from the mother, well, this infertility will be extended more. And there are some women that as they extend breastfeeding until 1 or 2 years of age of the baby, and by having less feeding and by breastfeeding the baby several times a day, they are still infertile. But Mela said that it was only until 6 months, because that's when we can actually maintain this breastfeeding, exclusively breastfeeding. And the advantages of Mela, well, just imagine there's in a situation there has been a pregnancy before that, but having sexual intercourse after delivery is not an easy situation. And going back to sexual intercourse after delivering a baby, well, it's a situation in which most couples want to postpone further pregnancies, but don't forget to feed your baby properly. And, well, you can have sexual intercourse without any problems, and this helps the couple and helps them, reinitiate their conjugal lives. And not only that, but also we are encouraging the woman to do something that benefits her health and the health of the baby. We know that the mother's milk is the best for the baby, and this obviously poses lots of advantage for the mother. What are the disadvantages? Well, it means that you have to meet certain patterns that have to be somewhat strict, because otherwise Mela is not going to work. And and it's a self-limited method. It means that if any of the conditions fail, you're no longer in Mela, and that as from 6 months, you have to start register. But not all women are going to have this that is so marvelous, which is a successful breastfeeding. So what do we do in the postpartum situation when this breastfeeding is not successful? In other words, it has to be combined with other kinds of food, like bottles or artificial milk, or that they stop breastfeeding because the woman has to go back to work or whatever. So what we do then is initiate the register of the fertility indicators. But if there's still a very high breastfeeding rate, well, it would only be you fill in the register with cervical secretion when they have those sensations, as Eva said. So what we have to detect is the pattern. Perhaps this woman is infertile, but you have to see what the mucosal pattern is like. Will it be with or without the presence of mucus? But this is invariable, and I suppose, well, tomorrow, Esther Valdez will be talking about this in much greater depth. And also, in this situation, what could be extremely useful is to use an echography, because when you do an echography, and by seeing the size of the endometrium and by measuring the follicles in both ovaries, you can know in which moment of the cycle you are. And this obviously casts a light and could also help you perhaps with a couple that is very afraid or perhaps has had a very long period of abstinence, you can use that. And of course, you can also obtain mucus through. So what you do, you take a sample of the mucus, you place it under the microscope. We have a monitor that is an expert, who's Lourdes, and well, this tells you in which stage of the cycle you are, because as Eva pointed out, each one of the crypts produces a certain kind of mucus, and each one has a specific kind of mucus. So this can also give you an orientation on how close you are to ovulation.
Bueno, por terminar un poco.
Well, just to finish with the more special situations, we mentioned stress. So we're mentioning this because it's typical that, well, that with anybody, for any woman, it could affect her fertility. And it's important to bear this in mind, especially when a woman is learning about her fertility. Bearing in mind that there could be situations of stress, of affective stress, such as family problems and problems at work or whatever, or physical stresses or tensions, like feeling very tired or not eating properly. So these are situations that the body tries to protect itself against something that is affecting it. And this is important for women when they are registering the charts. When you see that there's something that is not, well, something that is happening that isn't supposed to happen, and men are affected by stress because, well, you can see that this appears in a chart. That's the advantage we have in this case. And there's a physiological explanation too, because very briefly, when the stress mechanism is activated, what happens is that the body is trying to protect itself against something, and it requires all of its energy to deal with that stress. And the reproductive function is not something absolutely central. Well, that is that the woman has lots of energy expenditure, and this has an influence on this system, on this axis, this reproductive axis, with the hypothalamus or testicles in the case of the man, and we have this mechanism activated, and this activates the reproductive system, and this as regards a chart. So what we need is that a woman knows, well, to recognize that she's having a moment of stress because there's something that isn't going well. And it's not going well because the pre-ovulation phase is lengthened. And it's an important thing for a woman to know that, well, that there's acute stress, or there's a very specific amount of stress, and all of this follicular development can be modified. So what you're going to see in the chart is that there are mucus patterns that do not correspond to this evolutionary pattern. This doesn't correspond to what should be happening, and that's when the woman has to stop and think, well, something's happening to me. That could make the cycle be altered. For instance, we work a lot with boyfriends and girlfriends, and well, their cycles, when they get closer to the wedding, their cycles go absolutely mad because they're very nervous.
Exámenes, muchas veces también mujeres con niños pequeños.
When you have to sit an exam, or when you're dealing with women that have very small children. Anyway, these are things that have to be taken into account, and that is the cycles. As I said before, we are not perfect machines, but rather cycles could present these alterations, and these are examples of stress. For instance, the white part of this is a fertile window, which is what we saw before, and where there's a stress cycle. This is just an example. Well, this woman noticed that she had a fertile woman that was too long, because she never reached the peak day of the most probable day for ovulation, vis-a-vis the example of a normal cycle where the fertile stage, well, the normal thing is that it be something agile, something that has a normal rhythm. And these are just examples, fertile phases that are long, or fertile phases that are interrupted. And I mentioned this before, and this will correspond to a normal chart of this woman. And these are real cases of users. And in this picture, you can see that the woman started up with a possible fertile stage, and it was interrupted because she had lots of stress. And then after that, what she did was go back to that fertile window and reach the peak day. Okay, so these are examples that are only used for cervical secretion, as Lourdes pointed out. But if you also use other indicators, such as temperature or self-palpation, should you use the thermal method, well, this could also help the woman confirm whether she's ovulated or not. And, well, talking about pre-menopause, this issue very quickly, well, it's a very big issue, and it makes me feel somewhat afraid, because this is when many irregularities appear in the cycle. So in other words, well, it's the equilibrium of fertility, the reproductive apparatus becomes older, so everything becomes wrinkled, as so to speak. So this is not from one day to the next. That is, menopause is when the woman has, 12 months have gone by without having any menstruation. In other words, she no longer ovulates. And this doesn't happen from one day to the next. And, well, this is what we know as pre-menopause, which is a period of time that can last between 5 and 10 years. And this starts at about age 40. So as from age 40, in Spain, well, menopause is focused on 50 years of age, roughly. But of course, this decline in fertility starts before, and it evolves little by little. And here, the good thing about a woman, when you know about this, because when they start this learning at a moment of premenopause, it's much more difficult. But when there's a follow-up of fertility, well, at the end of the day, what happens is that there's a hormonal alteration of a cycle. So what we find cycles that are very irregular. So these are shorter cycles with longer cycles, with mucosal patterns that are very scarce because the uterus neck also ages. So you have to monitor premenopause. That's a very important thing. And also, obviously, well, together with other indicators, if necessary, of course, echographies and medical checkups. So this is a picture so that you can see the cycles where you all suddenly have bleedings, and longer or shorter phases, and there's lots of alteration.
Por terminar, y ya damos paso un poco a alguna pregunta.
And to finish, I think there were some questions here. Well, we've spoken about fertility indicators, generally speaking. So you've seen that we've spoken about the different methods. We didn't want to focus on the methods specifically, because if you are a woman, well, this is what a woman has to learn. And if possible, assisted by a monitor that can teach them. It's important for that person to be properly certified. And of course, well, here you can see that the different methods, the Billings method, or Crediton, I think she said, that they only use to observe secretions and sensations, and the thermal system that uses more indicators. And this is a very personal thing. I know we always tell all couples, look, this is what you've got, and the important thing is to learn a method very well, because then each method has its own difficulties and its rules, and it's also, its own registers, and it's very important in terms of efficacy, the efficacy that we're looking for in a method, and you have to learn it well. And I'm not sure if I've left anything out. But I think there was a question, wasn't there? Well, the truth is that you explained it perfectly well, but the question is, well, they say, thank you for so much knowledge. And well, they say the doubt is when one is in menopause. Well, this is a question that they asked before. And, the cycles fail, the mucosal pattern cycles fail. So how can you prevent becoming pregnant? That's the question. Well, I think that this was answered, but the important thing is firstly to have a good register. That's a key thing. And then what I said before is equally true. The sooner you learn, the easier it gets. Because if you know that before you had lots of secretion and all of a sudden you have little, what you have there, you have a reference where you give lots of importance to sensations in the pre-menopausal stage. If it's the first time that the woman learns about this, I would recommend that they add more indicators, because many times, if you've never used secretion before, it could be insufficient, because there is very little secretion, there's much more dryness, and perhaps there could be ovulation, and perhaps, well, the woman doesn't really notice that, because these mucus patterns are more insufficient. But anyway, I will try to see each case individually, which is what we do at the end through teaching, our teaching actions. Sorry, can't hear the question. The speaker's not using a microphone. Although the microphone is on right now. Okay, microphone's on now. So you have a tremendous amount of experience because you've coached hundreds of couples in different circumstances. But this is a question for somebody that has never been in touch with natural fertility awareness, and who's listening to us online and will be listening to us later on, and in what has been recorded. So on average, out of every 100 normal women, and then each one will have their own little things and similarities, but how many of them manage to learn this easily? I mean, how many of them recognize their fertile window? That would be question number one. And question number two is, for how long are they comfortable when they understand the physiology and when they are aware of their window? Well, I think this question is for all three of you, but I'd like to know about your experience. Well, there is a study that the WHO did at some point in time, and, well, what they did was monitor women with different kinds of, well, different cultures and different methodologies and so on and so forth, and they came to a conclusion, and they saw that 95% of the women in 3 cycles knew their fertility window perfectly well. And, well, these could be different cases. Well, perhaps they need a little bit more time because of difficulties, because they had more complex cycles or whatever. But let's say that 95%, and this is the information they gave us, 95% of the women in different cultures and with different academic levels in 3 cycles, after 3 cycles, knew when their fertility days were. And normally, in what we do in our courses with couples, we have a minimum follow-up of 6 months, and we always tell them, look, when these 6 months are up, if we don't, we're not completely sure, we extend that. But they normally learn in 6 months. But circumstances also change. It's not the same thing if somebody comes along in a postpartum situation with mixed feeding. So you know that you're stressed. If you have a woman that is in a normal physiological situation, it's much easier. So this is why the learning has to be individualized a lot for each couple. So you can't just give a standard course. You have some basis, but then you have to customize the teaching. But we do recommend that people learn the natural methods even when they have not initiated sexual life. Well, that's interesting because there's no pressure. So then once you've initiated your sexual life, you need to have conjugal life. So, and you have to learn because that must continue. And, well, you have to achieve a normal physiological situation. And now, well, women learn that perfectly well. It has a very big acceptance, and it's equally true that the role played by monitors is fundamental. And we need to know how to put this across. And as Antonio said yesterday, we have to make it easy. It has to be put across in a very easy manner so that they can understand and learn it perfectly well without any constraints. Well, as regards to the role of the monitors, I think that sometimes they ask us, do you think I can learn this through a book? Or do you think that I can learn about this on the internet? Well, you can read all sorts of things, of course. But when doubts crop up, and when you have any doubts regarding interpretation, it's very important for you to receive coaching. So this is why we do these learning courses. We always do some individualized monitoring. And my husband is telling me, oh, look, stop looking up WhatsApp because I've received loads of questions. And I always say, look, if you have a doubt, ask immediately, because there are times when doubts, when they're clarified, help them a lot so that they can learn more things. Well, I say that fertility knows nothing about working hours or weekends.
WhatsApp entra y bueno, pues porque va.
Well, this has to do also with the days of the cycle, so there's nothing like holidays or anything like that. Well, it is true that if they have any doubts, they know that we are there at their disposal, and they know that we're going to deliver an answer as soon as we possibly can. And something else that I think is fundamental is the role played by men. It's basic, because if that woman is married or is going to get married, if we don't have the support of that man, when the time comes to learning, we're going to fail. So our mission as monitors consists in involving the men. That's fundamental, because if not, we're not going to achieve anything. All right, we'll finish here. Thank you all very much for listening, and that's all. Bye for now.